Yeah, Modal's attacking the north side. Huh? I don't know. What will happen if his army gets destroyed? He'll need a new model army. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, I get it. Oh, God. July 9th, 1943. The war in North Africa lost to him. The tide turned, at least for now, in the Atlantic War, and having suffered the humiliation of Stalingrad in the USSR, Adolf Hitler needs a win, and this week he tries to get it. This week he launches the Axis summer offensive, Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk. And now, a word from our sponsors.
More taste, smoother on the throat. Better smoke. Join the Time Ghost Army.
I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the hot news was the Allies launching a new South Pacific offensive, the first part of the big Operation Cartwheel, and many attacks and landings in the Solomons. Today, I'm going to look over there first before I get to Kursk, for there is a lot of action to cover. On the 4th, a combined Japanese Army and Navy attack, like that we saw the 2nd, does not go well. 17 Ki-21 Army heavy bombers, escorted by both Navy and Army fighters, are intercepted by 32 Wildcats. They lose 6 bombers and 4 fighters and do little damage. The Japanese are sending 4,000 men from Rabaul to New Georgia to reinforce. This begins the night of the 4th. But while they're doing this, Bull Halsey has sent 3 American battalions to take Rice Anchorage. This is on the north shore of New Georgia, and is to try to block any reinforcements coming from Kolombangara Island. It's a bigger operation than it sounds, with 7 destroyer transports carrying the battalions and an escort of 3 light cruisers and 7 destroyers. Both forces enter Kula Gulf, the Americans under Walden Ainsworth arriving first, just past midnight, and send thousands of shells into first Vila and then Bairoko Harbor. The Japanese destroyer force is led by the Nizuki, which is one of the first Japanese naval ships equipped with radar, so they know the Americans have entered the Gulf before the bombardment begins. They also know they're outnumbered, so they decide to abort. However, they fire 14 torpedoes into the Gulf before withdrawing to the north. American radar does not pick the Japanese ships up until they're almost out of the Gulf. And then one of the torpedoes hits the destroyer strong, sinking her and killing 46. The Americans do not think there has been any surface engagement, though, and that the torpedo must have come from a submarine. Halsey sends Ainsworth back the night of the 5th. He has 3 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, 2 of the latter rushed in from Tulagi to replace Strong, and another loaded with Strong survivors. Ainsworth's plan was simple. Once radar had detected the Japanese, he would use his cruisers to smother them with 6-inch fire at the ideal range of 8,000 to 10,000 yards, which he believed was beyond the range of Japanese torpedoes. His destroyers were placed in a subordinate role, using their torpedoes primarily to finish off the Japanese ships crippled by gunfire. This plan has several obvious flaws, since it overestimated the capabilities of radar-guided 6-inch guns against fast-moving targets, was totally ignorant of the capabilities of the Japanese Navy's Type 93 torpedo, and placed the American destroyers in a passive role. Well, they arrive on the scene at midnight and are at general quarters. 10 Japanese destroyers have left Buen for Vila with men and supplies. But they're not just traveling in one group, they are in 3. Nizuki is leading the covering force of 3 ships, and then there are 2 transport units of 3 and 4. And they're not just traveling, for they are inside the Gulf before the Americans are there. The first transport unit is detached by 1:40 a.m., but already at 1:06, Nizuki's radar has picked up American ships. I mentioned 1:40 because that is when American radar spots the Japanese. Well, 2 groups of them heading north and closing. The Americans open fire at 1:56 at just under 7,000 meters. They are concentrating fire on Nizuki in the lead. She takes several shells and begins to burn and will sink later on. The other 2 destroyers take minor damage, while sending torpedoes towards where the gun flashes are visible. Ainsworth orders course changed at 2:03, but it is too late. Light cruiser Helena takes 3 torpedo hits and splits in 2. One hits light cruiser St. Louis, but does not detonate. One barely misses the 3rd light cruiser Honolulu. Well, St. Louis and Honolulu then track and engage the 4 destroyers of Transport Group 2, opening fire at 2:18. One is forced out of action, 2 take minor damage, and 1 is unscathed. That's the end of the main action. The cruisers cannot find any more targets, and there is small destroyer skirmishing while rescuing survivors. At 3:30 a.m., Ainsworth heads for Tulagi, having claimed 6 Japanese naval ships sunk and several damaged. In fact, the final tally was 2 naval destroyers sunk and 5 damaged. In spite of this, they accomplished their mission, landing 1,600 men and 90 tons of supplies at Vila. In the process, they sank the Helena, making this a tactical victory for the Imperial Japanese Navy. After this, the Japanese only step-up attempts at reinforcing the Central Solomons. In fact, today, the 9th, 3 cruisers and 4 destroyer transports bring 1,200 men to Kolombangara. They face no Allied opposition. Also today, the Americans begin full-scale attacks towards Munda, but make very little progress. Last week's landings at Zanana on New Georgia itself are reinforced the 6th. And with the landings at Rice Anchorage, they now have a pretty large force on New Georgia, but of course they have yet to engage the main body of the Japanese garrison. And between New Georgia and Kolombangara, that's like 10,500 men, mainly there to guard Munda. As for the Allies attacking from Zanana towards Munda Airfield, well, that is slow going. They really underestimated the terrain they'd have to cross, because it isn't just jungle. It's also swamp. It also has streams. And it also has sudden rocky hills. There is no road. On the 4th, 2 regiments attack towards the Barike River, but they don't both reach it until the 8th. Once they do, an attack towards Munda is ordered for today. It goes off at 5 a.m. after a nearly 8,000 shell barrage by land and sea, and 70 tons of bombs from 88 planes. The attack is a failure. There's not even that much opposition, but the terrain is the big problem. But much, much larger attacks begin this week in the Soviet Union. On the 5th, the Battle of Kursk begins. The 2 sides between them have 2 million men, 6,000 tanks, and 5,000 planes. The Soviets have an advantage in all categories, but a huge one in artillery. We had an extra episode come out the other day that goes over the basic deployments. You may want to go check that out. At 10 p.m. the 4th, the Soviets capture some German sappers clearing a passage in a minefield near Tagino. One of them reveals to Central Front Commander Konstantin Rokossovsky that the attack is to begin later that night. He orders a disruptive bombardment at 2:20 a.m. In the south, the 48th Panzer Corps makes some limited attacks already that afternoon, and they are stunned to run into massive minefields. This confirms to Voronezh Front Commander Nikolai Vatutin that the offensive is about to begin, and he too fires a disruption barrage. Neither of these barrages, though, does a whole lot of disrupting. And at 4:30 a.m. the morning of July 5th, 1943, the German guns open up against the Central Front, signaling the beginning of the battle. The same soon happens to the south, and just after 5 a.m., both Central and Voronezh fronts start taking infantry and armor attacks in serious strength, hitting Pukhov's 13th Army in the former and Shistyakov's 6th Guards in the latter. 4th Panzer's massive tank fist of 700 machines was aimed at Shistyakov's 6th Guards. First came the Tigers, followed by the Panthers and the assault guns. The infantry and armored personnel carriers were riding on the tanks. 4 Panzer and 2 infantry divisions, 3,000 men, over 40 tanks, and 50 assault guns to the kilometer, on some sectors up to 100 massed tanks. To their right, 8 battalions of infantry have crossed the Donets and seized the Mikhailovka bridgehead, though as German engineers try to shift bridges into position for 60-ton Tiger tanks, Soviet artillery wreaks some serious havoc. A bit further south, though, 2 bridges are in place before noon, and the German armor begins pouring across. This is Kempf's battle group heading out to protect 4th Panzer's flanks. In the north of the Kursk salient, the Germans are attacking along 40 kilometers between Krasnaya Slobodka and Izmailovo, hitting both 13th Army and the flank of 70th. As I talked about a few weeks ago, German commander Walter Model is not sending in a huge armored spearhead, but using mainly infantry. For this first attack, Model had concentrated 9 infantry divisions and a panzer division, using his Tiger tanks and Ferdinand assault guns in small but powerful battalions, a deployment governed by his view of the Soviet defensive system, which Model intended to break by constantly feeding in new units to grind down the defenders. As the hours roll along, the German battering ram begins breaking through, and by the end of the day, Model's forces have penetrated nearly 10 kilometers into the Soviet defenses. At midnight, Rokossovsky talks to Joseph Stalin, who says he's sending the 27th Army in as a relief force. But Stalin has to change that in just a few hours because the situation in the south has grown more serious. Rokossovsky will have to manage with what he's got. Down south, all day long, Hermann Hoth's panzers savage the 6th Guards in the Cherkasoye and Korovino area. It's a beautiful day for flying, and the Luftwaffe blasts a pathway through which over 200 tanks roll. By the afternoon, Tigers have partially surrounded Cherkasoye, but the Soviets manage to evacuate it. Vatutin orders 2 corps to cover the road to Oboyan, and 2 more tank formations to move east of Lushki. Mikhail Shumilov is ordered to clean up Kempf's Germans, who've crossed the Donets. But remember, this is the first day, and Vatutin is already bringing in his second echelon and even his reserves, and also sending troops to Prokhorovka and Korocha. It must be said, though, in his favor, that he is under pressure from Commissar Nikita Khrushchev and Stavka to do something now rather than later. It also must be said that though Stavka thinks the situation down there very serious, there is this. Altogether, von Manstein's forces suffered 6,334 casualties on July 5th in order to penetrate Vatutin's first line of defense in a few places. Chestiakov's 6th Guards army suffered 7% losses, but its second line of defense was intact, while Shumilov's 7th Guards had done quite well in repelling most of Kempf's unsupported jabs. It was already apparent to both sides that Citadel was not going to simply bulldoze its way through Soviet defenses as previous German offensives had, but instead, costly battle of attrition was just beginning. I'm going to let John Erickson describe the first few hours of this day of the war. Now, for the Kursk coverage, I've used a bunch of sources. In terms of books, it's writers like Erickson, Glantz and House, Robert Forczyk, guys like that. But regular viewers of this channel will know I like to quote Erickson because he has a way with words. This is from The Road to Berlin. Within 12 hours, both sides were stoking the great glowing furnace of the battle for Kursk. The armor continued to mass and move on a scale unlike anything seen anywhere else in the war. Both sides watched this fiery escalation with grim, numbed fascination. German officers had never seen so many Soviet aircraft, while Soviet commanders, who had seen a lot, had never before seen such massing of German tanks, all blotched in their green and yellow camouflage. These were tank armadas on the move, coming on in great squadrons of 100 and 200 machines or more, a score of Tigers and Ferdinands in the first echelon, groups of 50 to 60 medium tanks in the second, and then the infantry screened by the armor. Now that Soviet tank armies were moving up into the main defensive fields, almost 4,000 Soviet tanks and nearly 3,000 German tanks and assault guns were being steadily drawn into the gigantic battle, which roared on hour after hour, leaving ever greater heaps of the dead and the dying, clumps of blazing or disabled armor, shattered personnel carriers and lorries, and thickening columns of smoke coiling over the steppe. With each hour also, the traffic in mangled, twisted men brought to steaming, blood-soaked forward dressing stations continued to swell. On the morning of the 6th, Rokossovsky tries several counterattacks, but they are pushed back by hundreds of tanks. The main German tank force this day is focusing from Soborovka to west of Ponier, 10 kilometers with over 1,000 tanks. Thing is, the Germans make less than half the progress the 6th that they did the 5th, because now they're fighting in the main Soviet defensive zone. Rokossovsky orders his armor to play defense, with tanks dug into the ground with only the turrets showing, and armored counterattacks only to be against enemy infantry. The Germans' Ferdinand assault guns suffer under Soviet infantry attacks this day. They do not have machine guns as a second weapon, so once their support is destroyed, they are vulnerable. The main problem was that the shock of mine explosions damaged the Ferdinand's 2 batteries, which were not shock-mounted in the hull. In a major oversight, Heeresgruppe Mitte had not requested replacement batteries for either the Ferdinands or the Tigers. Ferdinands don't have a turret for their 88 guns either. Once the battery fails, or they are immobilized by mines, they are not much good. 89 of them are deployed overall at Kursk, but 33 out of 45 in one anti-tank group are put out of operation or destroyed today in the north alone. On the 7th, the Germans attacked the central front in 3 columns, 14 divisions strong, towards Molotych, towards Olkhovatka, and towards Ponier. The last is a main railway junction on the Orel-Kursk line, but Olkhovatka is developing as the main thrust, high ground that would look out to Kursk. The Soviet commanders think that even though the fighting for Ponier is savage, it's a diversion from Olkhovatka. As the 8th dawns, the Germans hold the western edge of Ponier and attack with 4 panzer divisions and infantry from Ponier 2 towards Olkhovatka, but that day, and today the 9th, they realize they cannot budge the prepared and heavily fortified Soviet positions on the high ground 20 kilometers within the salient with frontal assaults. Model has been effectively contained. Model's troops had advanced no more than 15 kilometers. Despite sacrificing 50,000 men and 400 tanks to the god of war, they had utterly failed to penetrate the Soviet tactical defense. Operational freedom remained but a dream. Any hope of German success at Kursk rested squarely on the shoulders of Hoth's armada, struggling tens of kilometers to the south. In the south, on the 6th, Vatutin gets that 27th Army as relief, and Stalin agrees to send in more reserves, but repeats his orders. They are to fight a battle of attrition and keep the enemy in the prepared defenses until their counteroffensives, which I talked about last week, can begin. On the 7th, the SS Panzer Corps continues fighting along the road to Oboyan, 400 tanks hitting the 1st Tank Army near Yakolevo as the day breaks. It does not go well for the 1st Tank, although by now, a third of Manstein's armor is disabled, Erich von Manstein being the overall Axis commander here. As the day ends, Vatutin orders a counteroffensive by 40th Army against the columns aiming for Oboyan, but when it comes on the 8th, it has no bite because most of 40th Army's tanks and artillery have been sent to help 1st Tank or 6th Guards. Today, the 9th, 4th Panzer Army has 5 panzer divisions from Vekopene to Kochetevka, with 4 infantry ones covering their flanks as they head up the road, hoping to drive right through the last Soviet defensive line before Oboyan and Kursk, using dive bombers, artillery, and armored groups of up to 200 tanks each, hammering their way up the road. By this evening, they are 20 kilometers or so from Oboyan. But here they are stopped. They have driven deep into the 6th Guards' defenses and caused some 11,000 casualties this day. But it has been brutal for them as well, and they have not broken through, and they have not reached Oboyan. Hermann Hoth issues new orders to the SS Panzer Corps, considering the threat to his flanks late today, redirecting them. But those I'll talk about next week. And also next week, well, tomorrow on the 10th, another major offensive is set to begin, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. On the 8th, to draw attention away from Husky, a big force of the British Home Fleet cruise off the Norwegian coast. They are not attacked. And today on the 9th, the landing force for Husky concentrates around Malta. Alfredo Guzzoni runs Sicily's defense. He has like 240,000 men, around 60,000 of them German. The Italian troops are badly equipped, have pretty low morale, and many are at fixed coastal defenses. Well, there are Allied airborne assaults tonight, but they will be covered next week when the rest of the attack is. For this week's coverage of the war has come to its end. But what a week. One new offensive continues in the South Pacific, one new offensive is launched in the Soviet Union, and another will be launched tomorrow in the Mediterranean. Oh, and on the 4th, Polish Prime Minister in exile Władysław Sikorski dies in a plane crash in Gibraltar. He is replaced by Stanislaw Mikołajczyk. There is speculation that the crash is not an accident. For more on that, check out our Instagram day-by-day coverage of the war, which you can also find here under the Community tab. I'll end this episode with some foreshadowing of the future concerning what's happening near Kursk, and more specifically, what is to happen next week. This is a quote from Glantz and House. Although they did not fully realize it at the time, on the night of the 8th and 9th of July, and during combat the following day, Vatutin, Vasilevsky, the Stavka, and the German commands would make critical decisions that would ultimately decide the outcome of the Battle of Kursk. These decisions were based wholly on combat realities, which were, in turn, a product of decisions taken in earlier days, and the outcome of battles already fought. As in all battles, therefore, the ultimate outcome would result from both the conscious actions of the contending commanders and a healthy dose of chance. What those actions are of today and the days to come, we shall see next week. And who knows, maybe we have something special coming out next week like we did the other day. I mean, you guys paid for it. Well, those of you in the Time Ghost Army did. That's what finances all of our productions. These are the newest officers in the Army, and Tony Pucci is our Army Member of the Week. You want more cool specials and things like this and that? Then join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And check out our Time Ghost History channel for a whole bunch of awesome mini-series and historical documentaries. You will get lost there. Here's the video page. See you next time.